Back in 2010, I was an enumerator for the census. Now, it was because my job had become half-time at the previous church I served, and so I needed a little additional income, and it worked out great because I could go and visit people who hadn't yet filled out their census forms when I had the time. And now, if you've ever filled out a form, or if you've ever done any genealogy, you know that the census reports basically have all sorts of categories: age, gender, ethnicity. And I think it's just because we human beings like to put things and put people into categories. The census serves some more purposes than that. But as human beings, we tend to categorize, don't we? I'm not really sure why, but I'm guessing that if we know where somebody else stands, we know where we stand. And sadly, people who identify as Christians, or really any other religious sect, categorize people all the time. They throw out all sorts of negative labels, basically saying who's in or who's out. It's not a very Christian thing to do. But that may be part of the reason why Jesus gives the advice he does to his disciples this morning. And the advice is for us. I think he's giving us these lessons to get us to think a little bit more broadly about others. And he knows that it's a hard road to follow. Because really, who wants to forgive those who disagree with us, take advantage of us, or most of all, hurt us in some way? Well, Joseph's story in Genesis is a good case in this point. You may remember Joseph's story, the youngest of a large family. And of course, being the youngest, I think he was a little spoiled, a little egocentrical, and his brothers basically abandon him, leaving him for dead. He gets sold into slavery. And after many years in these positions, he finds himself in Egypt, and he works his way up through Pharaoh's court and becomes an advisor to the Pharaoh. And when drought causes famine and his brothers leave and go to Egypt to seek help, who do they meet? Their long-lost brother. Joseph has a position of power. He could have had his brothers thrown in prison. But what does he do? He hugs them, kisses them. Now his brothers see him and they know they're in the wrong. You can just feel the dread in that story. They've probably been carrying around guilt for years, and they're standing in shock and awe right before him. They're expecting their youngest sibling to vengefully pay them back, expecting a slap, a slug, a shout. Joseph hugs them, kisses them, and it's all the more powerful because it's a humbling message of forgiveness. Joseph's is a story of struggle and of growth. His experiences, though, it forced him to face who he really was. He had to face his inner self, lost his egocentricity. Obviously, as a slave, you can't be very egocentric. And eventually, all his journey brought him to Egypt. Was it God's plan that placed him there that day before his brothers? Well, Joseph seemed to think so, because he said, God sent me before you to preserve life. To preserve life. That is always God's plan. And that's what Jesus is up to as well. You know, we find him once again on the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus is teaching really his disciples. He's teaching all of us who already follow him. And he's teaching to love enemies, to bless and give even to those who give and take. It's an ethic of generosity for Christians living in a hostile world, then and now. How many of you got dressed, got to church, saying to yourself, gee, I really need a challenge today? Probably nobody. But hearing Jesus tell us to love our enemies is like going to coffee hour for burnt coffee and cake that was made where somebody mistook the salt for the sugar. But what about this? What if Jesus isn't giving us a set of rules? What if he's giving us a promise? A promise that the world doesn't have to be the way it is. What if Jesus is giving us the first examples of nonviolent resistance? Now that makes more sense to me, because it's counter to the interpretation of this text that makes followers of Jesus wishy-washy marshmallows. Say that 3 times fast. Wishy-washy marshmallows. That's not us. That we would allow abuse of any kind to happen to ourselves or to others. So, to understand Jesus' words this way, we need to understand the culture to which he was speaking. In the culture of first century Palestine, a person's left hand was used for, well, what we might call bathroom duty. It meant that you would never strike a person or greet a person with your left hand. If you were superior to another person, you would, if you were trying to abuse them or abase them, you would strike them with the back of your right hand. Never with the palm of your hand, because that would say that you saw them as an equal. Back of the hand for those lesser than you. Slap of the hand if you want a face-to-face duel. Putting someone in their place would be the slap of the hand. That's when they say a slap in the face. So now the picture Jesus is painting is this. If someone strikes you on the cheek, it's most likely going to be with the back of their right hand. Because remember, Jesus is talking about the victims here. So your oppressor will not see you as an equal. He's likely to hit you with the back of his hand. But if you turn your face, it means he has to strike you with his left hand, the back of his left hand. And even your oppressor will not use his own left hand. Some things simply weren't done. Jesus wants us to see sort of a comical situation here, I think. And I think he also shows us a little humorous resistance when it comes to giving up your shirt when your oppressor asks for your coat. It's likely that someone asks for your coat in repayment of a debt. You owe your oppressor something, and since you have no land, you have no money, the oppressor asks for your very coat because they can take it and sell it. Now, there were really clear restrictions regarding repayment of debts. You could not leave a debtor naked at sundown, no matter what he or she owed you. It was against every sense of decency and good order. So Jesus set up another strategy of resistance for them. He said, if they ask for your coat, just give them your shirt as well. Then you'd be standing half naked. And they'd be forced to deal with a new reality that you just set up. No, they say, I don't want your shirt, put it back on. And it might so disarm them that they would return your coat as well, turning the shame over onto your oppressor. And I think that's where Jesus' command, to love our enemies, to do good to those even without expecting anything in return. That's where Jesus' command becomes a promise. He gives us new ways of resisting evil. It's what moved Martin Luther King Jr. to kneel down with many brothers and sisters before water hoses and snarling police dogs. It worked. It worked because the authorities, the oppressors, didn't know what to do with this kind of resistance. It was something they hadn't seen before. Victims who refused to be victims. Victims who refused to fight back with violence. Victims who claimed their place and reshaped the battle completely. What Jesus teaches us is hard. Loving enemies is hard. Forgiveness is hard. Giving and expecting nothing in return. It's also hard. But when it is hard for you, Think of others who were able to offer forgiveness, to love rather than to hate. Peoples whose lives are shaped by a gospel deeper than hatred and stronger than revenge. So to accept Jesus' promise is to act in ways that change the cause and effect ways of our world. To love where it would be more than easy to return hate. To care or give when caring or giving gets you nothing in return. That turns things around as Jesus planned. And it's always the beginning of change in ourselves and in others.